Yesterday I read an article in the newspaper about Chairman Mao, or simply Mao, and the journalist was confused about why Chinese people still like Chairman Mao, and the only reason he come up with was propaganda, and that's maybe partly right. Then he also mentioned the Great Leap Forward and culture revolution as two others legacy from Mao. And I don't think that's the reason, nor do I think it is propaganda. And I'm going to try to make a more logical explanation. But I don't know really. I've never spoken to a Chinese person about this, so I don't know. But I'm going to try. And the short answer is that Mao stopped the decline of China that was going on for like 100 years and started modernize the country. And yeah, I think you can somewhat compare him to George Washington for the United States, somewhat. First off, when I go for a longer explanation, I would say that I'm not expert on Chinese history and my pronunciations are not terribly good, neither in English or Chinese places. The starting point is with the Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty came from the northern part of China and replaced the Ming Chinese dynasty about 1650 around. It took several years, but of course first they came down from the north, then they conquered the southern part over time, then they started to expand and they reached what I think is the biggest China there ever exists and maybe ever will exist, who knows. And the interesting part about this, I think, is pretty much very low populated and very resource poor regions they conquered. It's probably were a prestige project, you can call it. It wasn't really good for anything. Well, it has to have cost a lot of resource. And the Qing dynasty really wasn't. I mean, the Europeans had already started advanced, and the Ming was already starting to fall behind, but it wasn't really obvious, I guess. Maybe they would have catch up, who knows. But the Ming dynasty was pretty much terrible at promoting progress or advancement or whatever you want to say. And basically the Qing dynasty empire was basically a feudal state where the Manchu were on top of the society and they taxed the peasants. I guess this is like every other empire looked like, but the form of empire they built up was pretty well. The time of empires, like the Chinese Qing Empire, wasn't really modern anymore, and they started to fall behind. But before we go forward, I think it's important to say that although maybe they were falling behind, it wasn't really showing. As you can see in this map, they were still pretty much the dominant power, the superpower it always had been until this point. As you can see, you have a core region, basically the east coast, of course. And you have the western area and northern area, which is more of a lessly controlled, and I guess this area had a lot of problems with types, and so also you had a large part of the neighbors being subjugated or formerly, or at least somewhat subjugated, like Korea, Burma, Vietnam, even the Central Asian states. So the Qing dynasty wasn't really a failure at the start. If you compare it to other empires, and if you say that empires, the greatest empire is the biggest one, I guess Qing was doing pretty good. But that illusion, maybe you can call it, ended with the first Opium War, 1839, and that also is the beginning of what I called in the beginning 100 years of decline, or I think the Chinese call it 100 years of shame. I don't know, it's a term for it, I can't remember. Anyway, and this started a lot of problems, because after the Opium War was fought and the Queen China lost, you have uprising, which the most famous, I guess, is the Taiping revolt. It was 15 years, I think, and it was very hard to defeat them. And the interesting thing about this, it's the same time as the Chinese were pushing, the Europeans were pushing Chinese, they fought civil wars. At the same time, Japan was starting to modernize, and they had it was a lot easier, of course, because they didn't have all these problems. Of course, it was some European pressure, but it's kind of easy to defend the island, and I don't know. It actually was more than just Taiping rebellion, but that's the most famous. To defeat them, they was forced to, the Qing Empire was forced to decentralize the structure of the empire, to give the local nobility a lot more power, and they then paid the central authority by putting up soldiers. So China was actually becoming more and more vassalized, not the opposite. Of course, the empire was trying to modernize its army and economy and so on, and had several attempts doing so, and basically they all failed, because when they put a lot of power in the nobility wasn't really interested in changing a lot. But of course, any change could mean that the nobility lost power, because maybe the bankers or any other group would take power. So I guess, wasn't total failure, but basically it wasn't enough. Basically, the empire fell in 1912. And I think, as you said, also that the Chinese population was growing rapidly, and sometimes a lot of disease and wars and civil wars killed a lot of people, so the pressure wasn't too high. But for several hundred years, there was always the problem with a growing population, and of course land doesn't grow, and this was an economy based on land, so it wasn't basically enough land to anybody, and the Taiping rebellion did issue a land reform to give land, and that was probably the main cause for a lot of the problems. And when the Chinese empire fell and the new republic were established, basically the nobility had given so much power, the whole country started to, of course, was the Western pressure too. The Western nation was carving up basically colonies within China, and the other areas wasn't carved up by the Europeans, were carved up by the Chinese warlords that were coming up. This was basically the nobility have given power a couple of decades before, and now starting to really break up China in private empires or private states. And of course, this nobility was basically a large corruption, and it wasn't great. And basically, the Kuomintang eventually became the leader of the country and somewhat united it. But it was more like the Kuomintang allied itself with all the warlords, and all the warlords said, okay, let us pay some small some small part of the tax to the capital, and they changed the capital to Nanjing, in the middle of China, I would say. And basically, they tried to modernize the country, didn't do very well, was very corrupt and very inefficient. And at the same time as the empire was falling apart, the new republic was established with Kuomintang, the party was taking over. The Chinese Communist Party was established, and basically it was a civil war until the Japanese invaded China in 1937, and then there's the war between the Chinese alliance and the Japanese just continue, and basically the Japanese wasn't really hard for the Japanese to invade China, and they occupied large areas but then stopped, and then was basically a long border war. Then you had a civil war, and then because the Kuomintang wasn't really efficient, they didn't have the support of the people because of all the corruption. The armies wasn't really good either, but it was a lot large. And basically the communists did get some help from the Soviets. Eventually, it wasn't really a big love between the Soviet Union Communist Party and the Chinese Communist Party, but eventually they got help from Soviet Union. And then in 1949, the Mao proclaimed the People's Republic of China, and that is the present day China. And of course Kuomintang and Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan and established the other China, which is now called something I can't remember, it doesn't really matter. Basically Taiwan. And now we're going to end. Of course, then Mao started to do some mistakes, you could easily say. But in the long run, Mao's China has been a lot better than the previous China. But you can also ask yourself how much propaganda it is, because I guess Kuomintang was trying somewhat, and was probably a lot of problems, and a lot of problems were already existence when they came to power. So how much Mao saved China, you could of course say that is all propaganda. I don't think so. Basically Kuomintang was almost in control of the whole country after the Second World War, but the army wasn't functioning, the corruption was very big, and the economy was not growing very well. Well, I hope I have make a logical explaining why Mao is still regarded as a great leader in China, and it's not only propaganda.